Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen Khan.
And I'm Simon Cooper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast. Last week's episode was on best friends Nico Williams and Lamine Yamal, the changing face of modern Spain. If you haven't already, be sure to check it out. Emma Hayes is probably the most important and successful football manager you may not have heard of. She's been titled the best coach in the world and is the face of one of the fastest growing sports in the world, women's football. Hayes has just left the Chelsea women's football team after winning another league title, and this summer she's heading for the biggest job in women's soccer, to lead the US women's national team beginning this summer in the Olympics. We're going to explore the story of a woman who's a pioneer in her sport, in biomechanics and psychology, and whose managerial career has been marked by trophies, personal loss, and a near life-threatening health condition, which I also share with her.
So who is Emma Hayes?
And is she, as many claim, going to be the first woman to break into men's football coaching?
And should she even want to? Why does she have to be in men's football? Why not help make women's football great? And what I find fascinating about her story, which I've been learning about, researching these last few days, is how through her career, you see the transformation of women's football these last 20 years.
So Emma Hayes has now won 5 FA Cups and 7 Women's Super League titles as Chelsea manager, her last being the 4th in a row she won this summer.
She's been named FIFA's Coach of the Year in women's football in 2021 and is the standout female manager in a game where female coaches are still not the norm, even in women's football.
So Simon, if you take Hayes out of it, when did you actually take an interest or become aware of women's football?
I was at school in the US for a year when I was 10, 11. And at lunchtime on the playground, we have these big soccer matches and everyone would play, boys and girls. And it was completely normal there. But then when I went back to Europe and growing up in Europe, I never saw girls play. It was just understood that only boys and men played football. And I have to admit, I have to do a kind of self-accusation here that I began to take it for granted that, of course, football was only males. And all my career, while I was writing about it full time, I was writing about men's football. And I know that women hate it when men say, oh, well, my attitude to sexist issues changed when I had a daughter. But I have to admit, my attitude being to women's football, kind of my eyes opened when I had a daughter. And when she was 8, she wanted to play, and my sons who were younger wanted to play. So we put them in a club. And I saw what a nightmare it was then for girls in Paris who wanted to play football because there were so few of them. She was the only girl on the team.
This is Paris in what, the 2010s?
This is about a decade ago, so about 2014, 2015. I think she was the only girl in the whole youth section of the club then, and the boys wouldn't pass to her, and she was treated as a pariah. And eventually she found a girls' team that was like 45 minutes away on the street near our house where the boys kicked a ball. She wasn't welcome to play there. So she was completely excluded. And already now, 10 years later, that would be different, that an 8-year-old girl would find way more opportunities to play soccer in Paris. But trying to battle for my daughter and get her a team and get her accepted in the team, I saw the incredible discrimination within football that I had been part of, as a writer and had taken for granted all my life until then.
Does your daughter still enjoy football, or she fall out of love with it?
She kind of fell out of love with it because she experienced it as this sexist environment. Girls' football was also really hard because there weren't enough girls, so you'd be in a team with girls from the age of 8 to 12. So there'd be a massive variance in quality. And she became quite resentful of men's football, so she doesn't like watching men's football anymore. But when the Women's World Cup was on last summer, she felt, right, this is it. This is real football. She said she only really wants to watch women's football.
That's interesting. So I played with my brother, who's a little bit older than me. I played sport. I played cricket and football, which meant I was always the girl in the boys' team at playground levels. And I never really felt that I was discriminated against. It was just odd that I was the girl. And also when you're a kid, it's kind of like you feel like you're a bit special because you're the only girl on the boys' team, and that makes you kind of hard and better than the other girls. But then even in my adult life, I lived in Brussels for a couple of years, and they have kind of the journalists play football amongst each other in the press corps. And the women could play in the men's team, but if a woman scored a goal, it would count for 2 goals. And there would be this odd point scoring system, which would mean that the women's contribution was double. And I was like, I absolutely want no part of this. And this is just a couple of years ago in a relatively evolved sort of milieu of people, of foreign journalists. And I thought, actually, this is very odd. But I guess for me, Hayes is important not because of the playing of the football, but because about 10 years ago, I was a budding journalist who was probably destined to be a sports writer. That's how I got into journalism.
That's what you really wanted to do.
Exactly. It's what I did at university. I wrote pieces about sport, things that interested me or sort of adjacent to football, but were very much about football. And I was lucky enough to get a brilliant job at the Telegraph as a trainee on their sports desk. And at the end of my sort of rotation, they said to me, we'd love to keep you. We'd love to develop you as a football journalist, perhaps give you a column. We enjoy your insight.
The dream story that every young journalist wants to hear.
Yeah. And I said no. And it was clear to me that I was always going to say no after a couple of months in and around sports journalism.
Why did you not feel it was the place you wanted to be?
So it was nothing to do with the Telegraph or the newsroom, and it was everything to do with what you do on the beat as a sports journalist. So you're out covering events, right? So I did a bit of Wimbledon. I'm at Lord's covering a testimonial match for Sachin Tendulkar. I'm going to press conferences at London clubs before their games. And the way people would look at me would be like, she's just some positive discrimination thing gone wrong. And I knew that wasn't true, but I wasn't able to stick around and prove myself. And the reason I think Hayes is important is that if there was someone like Emma Hayes around in football, maybe that would have given me a bit more of encouragement to stick around. But it's changed in broadcast journalism. It's actually also changed in the written press as well, and my own newspaper, The Times. And if you look around, actually, there's way more females kind of doing sports journalism on a par with men. And that's partly the story that we're going to tell through the life of Emma Hayes.
Let's go for it.
So Simon, what are your initial impressions of Emma Hayes?
Well, researching her for this podcast, I was really struck by the way she talks about management in a kind of human way, seeing her players, first of all, as human beings, as vulnerable people in a way that I've never heard from a male manager, not even in these days, which are a lot more psychologically advanced than the caveman days of male football that I grew up in.
It's true. And I think I first took notice of Hayes when Chelsea were playing a semi-final of the Champions League against Lyon, and they lose the game. And in the press conference, she opens with this mea culpa about why she wasn't able to give her players everything because she had a baby the previous season and she wasn't emotionally available for them. And I was like, this is nothing that I've ever heard in and around football. You do not hear people speaking like this who are managers in charge of players, right?
There's a little bit of Gareth Southgate in that. And I say that in a really good way.
So who is Emma Hayes? Well, Emma Carol Hayes was born in 1976 in Camden, North London, on an estate where 2 football pitches divided her social housing blocks. She describes herself proudly as being working class. Her father is a man who's had many small businesses like bakeries and running foreign exchanges. And she grows up with her older sister playing football in the streets with boys and girls and idolizing 80s heroes like Paul Gascoigne and Maradona.
And very excitingly, she was at Parliament Hill School.
Exactly. So this is where the Venn diagram of your life and her life intersect.
So Parliament Hill is a girls' school until the age of 16. And then all the local schools mix into a shared mixed sixth form, which I was in. And so, yeah, Emma Hayes and I could have met if I knew I'd been significantly younger.
So there's something else you have in common is that you also both went to Highbury to watch Arsenal regularly, but neither of you committed to being Arsenal fans.
Yeah, so when I was 16, I'd grown up in a town in Holland without a professional football team, or indeed without really anything else. And so living in London, it was incredibly exciting because you could take the W3 bus to Tottenham or the W7 to Arsenal. And for about £5, you could stand at Highbury. And so I did.
I think Emma Hayes has a similar experience. She's regularly going to Highbury. And I don't think, a lot of people, when they become figures in football, don't ever say they had a team because it sort of maybe compromised them a little bit. But I think she's genuine when she says, I did go to the Arsenal, but they were not my team. It's just something that you did because it was a local team and it was quite close by. And she was obsessed by football, right? But women's football, as a profession, we know it today, wasn't really a thing in the 80s or the early 90s when Hayes is growing up in England. She does, as I said, go to watch the Arsenal, but she's playing football a lot. But it's very clear very early on that she's not going to make it as a footballer because she has this very odd and sounds like painful condition where she doesn't have any cartilage in her right foot. She has a freak skiing accident and then discovers this later on by having x-rays. So she finds it really painful because she's left-footed. So when you plant your right foot to hit a left-footed shot, pain courses through her legs. So very early on, the idea of becoming a female footballer, which actually, if you're at Arsenal, is something that's a possibility, because Arsenal are basically the only team that have become in any way renowned in amateur women's football. They're still the only dominant force. They're the only club that's really ever put resources into women's football. And their dominance sort of sticks around until Hayes sort of takes over Chelsea and usurps them.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about Arsenal sort of from the late 80s on is that it was quite diverse in a football world that wasn't really. So you had a lot of black Arsenal players who were totally accepted, which wasn't the case at other clubs in the 80s. You had some black people in the stands. And so the fact that they had a women's team and took it somewhat seriously, I think is part of Arsenal being a more impressive organisation ahead of the game in that way in those days. And she would have seen that and felt, I'm sure, impressed by that.
I think the young Hayes sounds like a pretty impressive figure. And in some ways, I see a lot of myself in her. But what she gets involved in is Camden life, right? So she's involved in lots of social projects. She sets up a league in Regent's Park to help Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities sort of get beyond their sectarianism and play football.
Yeah, Regent's Park is all sectarian football. I used to play there with Algerians and Serbs, and it was.
But that league still exists, and I think it shows some degree in which she's a young woman of a degree of emotional maturity that she's able to get involved in, these types of community issues which are quite tense and difficult. But as a blonde white woman from North London, I think she has the kind of personality and the magnetism that means that she's able to bring a lot of these people together. That league is actually still going in Regent's Park, and I think it now has like 4,000 to 5,000 players. So
that's amazing. Wow.
The Emma Hayes legacy in some ways courses through the community level football.
That's a beautiful thing to have done, to create a sort of diverse football league that still exists.
So as a teenager, it becomes clear to Hayes that she's not going to have a job in football. It's just not a viable career option, because beyond Arsenal, which is sort of the apex of women's football, where she knows a couple of the coaches and people who runs the women's team, there's no one really around. This is not a professional sport. It's not somewhere where people can earn a decent living. So she does what we would now say everyone else do when they need to find a normal kind of job. They go to university. But I think it's not obvious for her that she's going to go to university. She's the first person in her family to go to university. She describes getting her head down because she's not particularly academically inclined, but her teachers tell her, Emma, you could really do something with your life. And she says that if she didn't go to university, she'd probably still be in Camden running projects for community football in and around where she grew up. But she does go to university, and she ends up in Liverpool, and she discovers that she really enjoys languages. She studies Spanish and European studies. And this is also where I resonate with her, because she's a Brit who's really interested in Europe, and not because she's really interested in Britain and therefore she's interested in Europe, but she really, really just wants to understand this continent. She studies Spanish, she's interested in the Basque people, she thinks about the stateless Kurds, she thinks she could be a UN peacekeeper. She goes on to do her master's in international relations and intelligence, which then leads her to put in quite an odd job application.
She applies to be a spy. She says at one point, I had no ambition to be a football coach. I wanted to be a spy for MI5 or MI6, which are the British security services. So she sends in a job application.
She claims that she never hears back.
Yeah, that's what you have to say, right? I applied to MI5, never heard back. Anyway.
Is that how people get in? Do you have to apply? I always thought you get a knock on the shoulder in your junior common room or something. Or is that from like the Cold War
if you're
period?
very posh. So I was at university with this very posh bloke, and he got a tap on the shoulder, but he said he was asked to be a spy, but he said he didn't want to do a job that he couldn't talk about at dinner parties. That's where the kind of upperclassness...
That's the trade-off.
That's the trade-off, yeah. And I was very aggrieved because I was not that posh, but I was doing German, which was, the key spying language I'd have thought of the 80s. And I never got a tap on the shoulder.
I thought I'd get a tap on the shoulder because we're living in the post 9/11 age. I was like, definitely someone's going to tap me up to come and spy on my people, right?
But you felt to be unreliable.
Potentially. I think my mouth was too big.
Yeah.
I don't think Emma Hayes, I think she has incredible qualities, which we're going to talk about. I'm not sure how she would have fitted into the British intelligence services in the post-Cold War era of the 1990s.
It's an intriguing thought. You and Emma working together in MI5, are you spying on British Muslims?
Our people.
Yeah.
And her teaching me about the Kurds. But it's an extension of all the other jobs that she thinks she can do. She thinks she can be a UN peacekeeper. She's really, really interested in the world, and she's not that interested in Britain, actually. And this also, we'll get onto it, is why she leaves the country pretty quickly to go and chase her footballing ambitions. So she applies to MI5 and thinks she can do all these other jobs because there's just no way she's going to have a job in football until 1999. 1999 is a very big year because it's when the World Cup, or the Women's World Cup, is being hosted in the US. And there are thousands and thousands of women and fans who are going and flocking to stadiums to watch these games. And among one of the attendees is Hayes' father, who is in Atlanta, Georgia, and is in one of these packed stadia watching a Women's World Cup game. And the first thing he does, which I imagine in the late 90s, he might not have a mobile phone, but whatever, he finds a phone, calls his daughter, Emma Hayes, and says, you need to get the hell over here because this is a country that takes soccer, women's football, really, really seriously. This is where people watch it. And this is where you can break through into the women's game, not the UK, which he describes as a brain-dead, quite parochial place where women's football is completely marginal. It's not professional at all. And she doesn't need a second invitation.
She's found the promised land, the US.
Exactly.
Well, I think we need to keep in mind the hypothesis that she is actually a spy and that the US women's national team job is just deep cover.
Yes, I'm sure Donald Trump is going to be amazed to see Emma Hayes around trying to infiltrate the US women's national team. But as I said, she jumps on a plane. It's 2001. She's in her early 20s. She arrives in upstate New York just after 9/11, actually, and is getting about something to like $150, $200 a week to run these workshops for American soccer players who want to sort of break into college games and become professional footballers. And she's training them.
So she's having a great time. And can you just tell me the name of the club where she begins her coaching career?
Yeah, I mean, in a vast field, I think one of the worst named teams I've ever heard of. But
I think maybe the worst named team.
Emma Hayes ends up coaching a team called the Long Island Lady Riders for 2 years. I think the club don't exist anymore. Anyway, Long Island Lady Riders, Hayes is doing really well. She wins Coach of the Season in her second year. She's the youngest female manager in the entire league. And then she moves on to better things. She goes upstate New York at a small college where she begins to notice things about coaching women which are quite special. And one of them is that in one season, so in the space of a couple of months, because they have very truncated seasons in the women's football leagues in and around the US, is that 3 of her players get ACL injuries, so anterior cruciate ligament injuries, which now we know about a lot because they're seeming to be much more common in the men's game, which is these very serious soft tissue injuries, which can take up to 8 to 12 months for players to heal from.
And are much more common in women's football, which is an early clue that men and women have different kinds of bodies and that this may affect how they play football and how they are footballers.
And while she's managing girls, some of whom are taking football very, very seriously, she picks up a lot of insights about how to manage women, the atmospheres in dressing rooms, the physiognomy of female football players, why they're not able to recover from their muscle injuries as fast as men, how the entire football profession is not really geared to understanding how to treat women, their hormonal cycles, the things that motivate them, how they behave on the pitch with each other and with the opposition. So she is collecting a lot of insights about how to make female players tick that are going to become really instrumental to her success when she's back in England.
I think what we're seeing here is that she's entering a world, football, that had been designated male for over a century and that had been kind of configured for men. Everything from injuries to the size of the field, to the size of the goals, to how you interact with each other in the changing room. It's a world built for men, just as most corporations are built for men. And what she and other women in this era are trying to do is to take this male world and say, no, we're not just going to fit women into the kind of male structure. We're going to change this structure and make it different for women.
And I think more than any other figure that we're probably going to be examining, she's someone who's at the frontier of pioneering an entirely new sport with its own philosophies, its own ethos, and its own ethics. And she very much feels that responsibility. I think even at this age where she's, still in her early 30s, that she thinks that this is her responsibility to do this kind of stuff. But Hayes' guiding philosophy when she talks about football and women's football is that she's not coaching little men. This is not a mirror of the men's game. It's something unique in and of itself.
Yeah, and women's football will also develop slightly different tactics, for example, because the female left winger will not cover as much ground as the male left winger. So you just end up with different tactical systems.
So she's having a great time in the States and she loves sort of nicking things from other coaches. And one of the sports that she
all,
loves...
all intelligent people do that, nicking ideas, yeah.
One of the sports that she loves is the NBA. She talks a lot about Steve Kerr, who's the hyper-successful managers of the Golden State Warriors. She loves the Chicago Bulls. She'll also end up in Chicago because of how much she loves the Chicago Bulls and that team. And she's always, because she's in a field where she's basically developing the women's game, the only real sort of idols and heroes she has in the coaching profession are men in other types of sport.
Yeah. So she says, I was born in England, but I was definitely made in America. That I'm certain of, from winning mentality to determination. I was very struck by that in her 20s, she has this voyage of discovery, which would have been impossible in any other country.
Exactly. But she does head back to the UK, and that's because in 2006, she gets a call from Vic Akers, who is a totemic figure in women's football. He is the man that makes the Arsenal women's football team such a dominant force. She goes back
to her local club.
Yes, North London for 2 years. And in that time, Arsenal also win, at that time it's called the UEFA Cup. We now call it the Champions League, but she's the assistant coach, right? So Vic is doing the manager role while she's training the girls on the pitch. And she has a very good time, but I think the pull of the US is just too big for her. And vitally, she gets a call from Chicago. I've already mentioned she loves Chicago. She's obsessed with the Chicago Bulls. She can't really resist the pull of going back to the US. So she ends up in the Midwest. And this is where she has probably still the worst period in her managerial career. She flops with the team. She's sacked in a Starbucks in the middle of the season. And the only notable thing when we
in
look back...
In a Starbucks, that's adding
such an
humiliation.
American thing, yeah.
Insult to injury, okay.
So she gets sacked from the Chicago Red Stars sitting in Starbucks. And the only notable thing when we look back at her time in Chicago, her brief stint, is that the US women's soccer leagues have drafts. And midway through what would be her last few months at Chicago, she picks a certain Megan Rapinoe as her number 2 draft pick and gives her break in women's soccer.
The future most important female player of her generation.
Exactly. Their careers, again, now will intersect once more, now that Hayes is going back to the US in 2024. So it's 2010. Emma Hayes has now managed 3 clubs, 2 of them at semi-professional levels, one in which she's considered to have been a total flop in Chicago, a job which she says that maybe she shouldn't have taken, but her heart was bringing her back to the US. So Emma leaves Chicago in a bit of a disgrace. She thinks that she's a failure. It's the first setback of her managerial career, and she's ready to pack up football altogether. She's ready to close that chapter on her life. But she's managed to glean loads of insights in how to be a successful coach in the women's game. And this will help take her to the apex of women's football, where she will drag this game up to a professional level that we've not seen before in England, and also ride the tide that is the phenomena of women's football around the world.
Stick around to hear how she does it.
Are you loving listening to Heroes and Humans every week? Do you hate the wait between our weekly episodes? If so, why not join our official H&H Supporters Club on Patreon? This exclusive community is the place for behind-the-scenes, sneak peeks, Q&A opportunities with me and Simon, and more bonus content. The link is in the episode description and on all our social media bios. This is a reminder that you're listening to the Heroes and Humans of Football podcast with me, Mehreen Khan.
And me, Simon Cooper. Emma Hayes has left Chicago a failure. She's ready to abandon football altogether, and she spends a year jobbing around her father's foreign exchange business in central London, and I imagine she's pretty good at it. She could have made a living there.
Not only is she good at it, I love this story, but her dad runs a physical foreign exchange, and she's like, Dad, it's the 2000s, right? We need to get on the internet. And somehow she's picked up how to code. So she sets up the sort of online presence for her father's business in Soho, and they become a digital operation. So this woman who's been coaching women's football for the last 5 or 6 years has also met enough people around the game who understand how to code and builds a website.
Wow. And she could also have been a spy. I'm beginning to think she's what our friend Joris would call highly gifted. She has a special brain.
She does.
Yeah.
And she is sucking up information, right, from digitalism. And she meets women in the game that she becomes friends with, and they help her out in various other parts of her life. So in 2010, we've already said thinks football's done. She goes to the World Cup. She has a good time. She blows the vuvuzelas, and she thinks that football's just not for me anymore. Until we get to 2012. It's the London Olympics. It's a scorching summer. It's one of the best summers I've ever had living in London. Mo Farah's winning gold medals every other day. Emma Hayes, a bit like every other Londoner, is rejoicing. And I think what becomes like the peak London era of 2012. And just around the time of the Olympics, while they're going on, she gets a call from one Bruce Buck, the American chairman of Chelsea Football Club. And he calls her up and says, "We need a coach. Our team sucks. Do you want to do it?" So Emma Hayes' reputation in some sense is already preceding her. And she's not expecting the call, but she knows people around. She knows some of the players at Chelsea who need a coach. And they were like, "We think you should get Emma Hayes." Bruce Buck picks up the phone. She snaps his hand off. She barely has to listen to the salary she's getting or the project that she's getting. She's getting about 60K to build one of the worst teams in women's football.
So the whole team budget is about £60,000.
Exactly. And this is a club which has just won the Premier League in 2012. Again, the men's side of the
men's
game.
side, yeah. The women's side, not very good.
The women's side, nobody's ever heard of.
Right.
She gets on a scooter. She rides from Camden to Cobham in Surrey, the training ground. And she takes the job and she gets there and it's a pretty desolate environment. She sees nothing but empty fields. They don't even have water bottles. She has to steal them from the youth team.
Sorry, how do we envisage the stealing the water bottles from the youth team? You sneak into the changing rooms and no one's looking?
The Lucozade crates, right?
You grab them and you run off with them.
Do it in the dead of the night.
Yeah.
But all she sees is potential. She sees a complete blank slate to build a team. She could have gone back to Arsenal because she gets offers from Arsenal to go and build on already the winningest team in women's football, but she doesn't want to do that. She wants to start her own legacy. I find this really fascinating that she's at Chelsea, the dominant force in English men's game right now. So she has the branding of Chelsea, she has the Chelsea shirts, the Chelsea logo, the Chelsea sponsorships, all the trappings at being at Chelsea. And she's got a team full of not even semi-professional, amateur women who earn next to nothing in training facilities, no offices, no real dedicated resources for them. And she's going to build this thing from scratch.
So she takes over Chelsea in 2012. The first thing she does is she gives the players a salary and tells them they're coming in 5 days a week for training, which is new because a lot of them just have regular jobs outside football.
So one of the first tasks that she has is to clear out her players. She wants to professionalize this game, which is essentially being played at an amateur level. And one of the first things she needs to do is try and find players in a game where they're basically being paid not that much above the minimum wage and are living in London. And this is despite the fact that this is the draw of Chelsea, the great Chelsea who've just won their third league title in about 7 or 8 years.
On the men's side.
On the men's side, which is run by the Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich, who are a dominant force, who are signing, players on the men's side for tens and tens and tens of millions of pounds in transfer fees. But she doesn't have any of those embarrassment of riches at her hands. She just has herself and the Chelsea badge to bring players in.
So she has to do everything herself.
It's like a throwback to coaches, I imagine from the 60s or 70s. You do everything. You're the chief scout, you're the HR department, you're having to find decent staff that you can work with, often men who are coming from the men's game into the women's game. And she's having to get them to unlearn so much of the stuff they've learned in the men's game and tailor it to the women's game. She's also trying to transmit this new philosophy of all the things that she's learned about the women's game. Emma's sitting in her car, schlepping across the country, trying to find players across England and Scotland. And then she has to come back to Cobham and deal with waterlogged pitches and beg Bruce Buck for a bit more cash because of the project that she's trying to build.
And go and steal more water bottles from the kids.
At one point, John Terry, who's then the men's captain, is donating a bit of his personal funds to help the women team build up their stadium, to help them deal with the decrepit surroundings of where they're playing and to make sure that they have enough resources so they can play a game every week.
And it works. Within 2 years, she takes Chelsea to the summit of the Women's Super League. And in the last 12 years at Chelsea, she's turned this amateur operation into one of the most impressive outfits in women's football, filling Wembley Stadium for the FA Cup final.
I think we should probably think about why they're so good. And a lot of what we discuss is how managers in the men's game operate. And I would say that there are big differences. And probably the big one is that she's not a tactician in the classical sense when we talk about other types of football coaches. What she's brilliant at is understanding what makes her individual players tick. She's a woman manager.
Yeah.
And she's very frank about the things that she has to deal with when you're managing women who are breaking into a sport which is not the mainstream. She's talked about how to help them with their eating disorders, the fact that they have financial difficulties.
Because they earn almost no money.
They own no money in one of the most expensive cities in the world. This is also West London, right? So you need to be close enough to West London to be able to get into training every day. She talks about their reproductive health that she has to deal with. And at this point, she's also absorbing huge amounts of knowledge knowledge from all spheres of the social and human sciences, reading Sigmund Freud, stealing bits from Sir Alex Ferguson to help her gain insights in how to motivate a team and create a winning culture. And one of my favourite ones is that she steals a Bill Shankly special. When she gets to Chelsea, the team that all the girls are scared of is Arsenal. They are absolutely dominant and intimidating to anyone who plays them. So the first thing she does is she nicks a Shankly tactic, which is to make her players train in the Arsenal kit.
That's amazing.
She hands out the Arsenal kits and she gets them to put it on and she runs a training session in them. And she describes the process of which the intimidation that they feel at seeing Arsenal just kind of melts away. And one of her crowning achievements is that very early on during her reign, Chelsea beat Arsenal in the FA Cup final. Chelsea pipped Arsenal to the Women's Super League. And the Arsenal dominance and the Arsenal fear melts away very quickly. And that's something that Hayes, who's an Arsenal woman, is able to really do at Chelsea. And I think that's the point where they kind of breach a psychological barrier that mean that Chelsea women's team are going to become the team that everyone fears, the new Arsenal in the 2010s and 2020s.
So she's drawing on the two essential sources of football knowledge, Sigmund Freud, Alex Ferguson. But what is it about her? How does she manage to become this dominant manager of the women's game? What qualities does she have?
I think there's two key factors. And the first one is the thing that you can't help noticing when you hear Emma Hayes talk about football is how incredibly introspective she is about what she's doing. Even though she's involved in like the day-to-day management of a team and all that involves, she steps back a lot and thinks about the philosophy of what she's doing, which is building a sport for a demographic, which is half of the population of the world, that has been given next to no attention by the men in the game and also some of the other women at the game.
Yeah, a woman like yourself who was following men's football until she came along.
I didn't pay much attention to it either. And I didn't think I would ever be somebody who would be interested journalistically or even personally in the women's game. But here we are. And I think we should just tease out all the differences, right? So the players who are playing for Chelsea women's team or any kind of semi-professional outfits in the UK are not like the boys who are doing it. If you're a male who is going to break into professional football at the elite level, you've probably been scouted at the age of 6 or 7. You've entered an elite academy in England where you've been pulled out of school and the only thing you're doing from a very young age is playing football.
And everyone in your family is obsessing about your future earnings and your career.
Exactly. It's the dominant force in those young players' life that they're going to become professional footballers. They go from elite academy to elite academy. Yeah, they're having trials. Some of them don't make it. But when they break into the top game, they've already spent, at the age of 21 or whatever, 5 or 6 years having football as the only thing in their life. And that's just not the case with female players. And I think the important difference is that when you're managing a women's football team, as she was at this stage, the gulf between the players in your team is huge.
There are some who are much, much better than others.
Exactly. So we now know that Chelsea have superstars. Sam Kerr, an Australian attacker, Lauren James, the sister of Reece James, some of the two standout players in the Chelsea team. But then you've got lots of other players who are just not operating on that level. And I think managing a women's football team, as Emma Hayes is doing, is a bit more like being in a traditional workplace where there's disparities and gulfs in people's talents and you have to manage them. Some people are very good
and some people are a bit mediocre, yeah. Whereas if you're in the men's changing room at a top club, that's not the case.
Pep Guardiola doesn't have to deal with the fact that some of the guys on his bench are just not operating at the high level. Yeah, they might not be as good as De Bruyne, but that difference is not the gulf that Emma Hayes is trying to manage between a Sam Kerr, for example, and somebody who's been at the Chelsea women's team for a few years but hasn't really ever kicked off.
Yeah, the one parallel in the men's game would be Messi and everyone else in his team, especially with Argentina, where he's playing often with people who should not be on the same field.
And he's a total exception and a massive anomaly in the men's game, whereas this is perhaps
normal
the norm
in women's football.
In the women's game. So this kind of introspection also leads to a huge amount of modesty. So Emma Hayes somehow found the time to write a book or co-write a book about leadership during her career. And it's called Killing the Unicorn. And the unicorn is a reference to this special mythical creature that she thinks special coaches get branded with. So the geniuses of the world, like Pep or Wenger or Messi. And she's like, there's no such thing as a unicorn. I'm not a unicorn. I'm not particularly special. I'm not a genius and I'm not a maverick. I'm just doing my job and I'm thinking about how to become the best leader, how to become the best coach. And it's quite, in some senses, a way to bring the mystique out of what she does.
Well, I think also what she's doing there is she's got this internal self-criticism mechanism. So she's always looking at herself from the outside and saying, I didn't do that well, I can do that better. And it's an incredibly powerful thing to have. And most people, I think, in positions of power don't have it because they don't like to feel vulnerable. Or do you think that maybe a woman is more likely to have that internal self-criticism mechanism than a powerful man?
I can only talk for myself, and I'd say yes. But I think the irony is that Emma Hayes would probably already hate the fact that we're doing a podcast about her and telling the story of her life. Because in some senses, her whole ethos is that there's nothing about me that makes me particularly unique or special. So even devoting the amount of attention we are to her right now, which of course I think is completely justified, almost goes counter against this sort of identity that she's built for herself. I think she's incredibly self-effacing in a very authentic way. She thinks about leadership in very holistic terms, a word that she likes quite a lot. And it also leads her to be incredibly human.
So what else? What does she have that makes her special?
If we're thinking about her as a boss, I think she's just someone that you would just love to work for because she's incredibly captivating and very honest. She's almost allergic to bullshit. She talks about her players like they're her actual family, and that's not disingenuous. I think it's completely authentic to who she is. And, you know, it's a bit of a cliche when you're talking about women in any sort of professional sphere to emphasize how empathetic they are or how much, you know, emotional maturity they have. But she does have it. And she's also a complete hard ass. She has this no excuses philosophy that guides her life. And that's because she's a working class woman who's never really been handed anything in her life, right? She actually has been working, she describes, since the age of 13. She's had jobs, she's had to work. And so when she's confronted with players that maybe just don't want to do it that day, she's not really going to tolerate a lot of complacency. She really wants to get the best out of them. And I think that probably makes her pretty special to work for.
I was struck by what she says at the end of the preparation before a game. She asks her team, I think the evening before, is there anything I've missed out in preparing you for this game? And that's the moment for the players or A players to say, yeah, I think we should talk about this, or I think we should do that. And if you don't pipe up, you can't then complain afterwards that, you know, the preparation wasn't good or something was missed. She's giving you that chance. And then she's saying, well, that's it then. If you don't have any issues, no excuses now. We are well prepared. You just go out there and do it.
Okay, now, Simon, we're going to talk about periods.
Yes,
I know that we cool?
I know that we can do this. Yes.
You're good with this?
I'm
You're
mature.
Ready. You're an evolved bloke.
I'm semi-evolved, yeah.
The menstrual cycle, as it's known. So Hayes is also a modern coach. She has been brought up in modern coaching methods. And one of the things that she really spends time obsessing over is the idea of marginal gains. That when you get to quite an elite level of any profession, you're looking for any small advantage that can help you do better than the opposition.
The person who banged on about marginal gains most, I think, was David Brailsford in cycling.
And in 2020, Hayes pioneers a training method where all of her players individually are going to be training around their menstrual cycles, because she realizes and she thinks about the female body that any of her players are 2 or 3 times more likely to develop the most serious types of injuries, which is soft tissue injuries, when they are undergoing a certain phase of their menstrual cycle. Hormonal changes in a woman mean that if you're a goalkeeper and you're coming out for a cross, your reaction time is going to be measurably slower when you're in a certain phase of your menstrual cycle, right? Your anticipation of shots is going to be slightly slower. Your senses are going to be dulled. And some of her players, this is a normal part of her reality, are just not around for training for days and weeks on end because they suffer very acutely from their periods. And you're probably going to learn in the course of this podcast, Simon, that some days when we turn up for recording, I won't even want to talk to you.
Well, I have to be able to distinguish that from the usual personality defects that you carry around, so I won't always be
We
sure.
can't always blame it on the hormones. And in some senses, this is self-evident. You're dealing with women, right? And women go through their menstrual cycle. But it's not self-evident, or at least it's not something that's been seen around changing rooms or training grounds around women's football.
Well, she has to kind of develop this knowledge from scratch because women's sport wasn't professionalized, so you didn't have armies of people and doctors who were paid to think about the problems of female athletes. So she's really having to pioneer this work.
And I think she's also doing something which is plugging a gap that's not just in sports science, but generally in the medical sphere altogether. So one of her strikers, who's now moved and left Chelsea, Beth England, suffers from endometriosis. Statistically, 1 in 10 women suffer from this condition. I am also one of them. And Hayes herself has it, and it gets to such an acute form that she needs to take a break from a season to have a major operation. But she helps Beth England understand her condition. She tells her, how can you manage it through your diet or your training schedules? How can we help you? And the other irony of this is I think a lot of men think that, okay, women have periods and women kind of understand their periods, but they know what they're doing. And the truth is most women don't. We don't learn this stuff at school. Her superstar player, Sam Kerr, when she arrives from Australia, is sat down in the Cobham changing room and is told that we're going to tailor your training around your menstrual cycle. And Sam Kerr sort of looks bemused at her assistant coach and says, I don't want to know about it. I honestly just want to play football. Just let me play football. I don't want to think about my periods. A lot of her players are going on this journey of self-discovery about their own bodies and why sometimes they're just not performing at the level that they usually are. And a lot of that is about the fact that they're in a different stage of their menstrual cycle.
And then in Hayes' own life and her own career, her reproduction, having kids, starts to intersect with her career in a way that in so many careers, of course, in any career, creates issues for women because often these career paths have been designed for men who are supposed to not spend any time going off and having kids and then spending time raising them.
Yeah, I don't know how many men in the men's game go off and take months and months of paternity leave.
No, in fact, nowadays a male player might miss a match to be present at the birth of his child, and that's already seen as quite evolved.
Yeah, I remember it happened with Chelsea a few weeks ago. Enzo Fernandez doesn't turn up for a game because his wife is giving birth, and there's outrage on social media that he would think this is important enough to miss a game for.
With Emma Hayes, this is now becoming the centre of her life story.
It is, because in the 2017-2018 season, Emma Hayes is pregnant. She has IVF and she's pregnant with twins. Chelsea are having a brilliant season. It's a season where they will win the double, so the league and the cup. But just a few weeks before the FA Cup final, with they're playing against Arsenal, Emma Hayes loses one of her children. So one of her twins is going to be stillborn. I imagine this is one of the most traumatic things that anyone can go through, but Hayes keeps it hidden initially from her players because she doesn't want to disrupt their preparation for the FA Cup final. So she only tells them afterwards, and after Chelsea have triumphed. She has a baby boy, Charlie, and she's back at work within 8 weeks of becoming a mother for the first time. She's subsequently gone on to say that she made a mistake, that she should have taken more time out from the game. She doesn't give herself the time to grieve. She's learning about motherhood at the same time as having this very, very high-pressure job.
And she comes out and says all this. She expresses this in public.
Yeah, in press conferences. So I referenced at the top of the show, listening to her press conference after the Lyon game when Chelsea don't win and get to the final of the Champions League, where she talks very candidly about grief, about handling motherhood. She thinks that the team have a very bad subsequent season, because she just couldn't deal with all of the emotional toll that came with being a mum for the first time and also dealing with loss and handling your players. She thinks that she is a source of emotional support for her players, but her capacity to do that was diminished in the following season because of what she was going through in her personal life. She even says now that she was probably, even a season after, so about 18 months after, she still thinks she's operating at about 70%. And when the pandemic comes around and the UK goes into lockdown in early 2020, she admits that it's probably the break that she needed so she could just sort of take a moment to understand all of the things that she's going through, her personal life, her professional life, and learn to be a mum.
I mean, as somebody who's steeped in following men's football, to hear somebody in the game talk like this is just astonishing. This just doesn't happen in men's football, that people open up in such a sophisticated and honest way about their personal circumstances.
And her sort of personal traumas don't end there. So she's a mother, she now has a little baby boy, but in 2022, Hayes is just having a terrible time. She's in pain a lot. She's uncomfortable in the dugout. She doesn't really understand the sources of all this, but she realizes that she does have very, very acute endometriosis. And to put it as succinctly as possible, endometriosis is a condition whereby women who are of reproductive age are going through their menstrual cycle, and the menstrual cycle involves the lining of your womb shedding and building up every 4 weeks or every 28 days. And endometriosis is a condition where a lot of women suffer from the fact that the tissue, their womb tissue, is actually growing outside of their womb, and it causes them insane amounts of pain. In 2015, I remember having to take months off work because I was bent double in pain. I had no idea what was going on and ended up having an operation.
Jeez.
And then being told afterwards that I had endometriosis after being fobbed off by doctors for weeks and weeks who told me that I had IBS or some sort of bowel condition. Now, Hayes has endometriosis at a very serious level, to such a degree that in the middle of the 2022 season, she has to undergo a hysterectomy, so the removal of her womb, and she takes the rest of that season out to recover. This is almost at a life-threatening level for her. It's a major, major operation. And she only discovers that she needs serious help when she's in the dugout at a game against Liverpool away, and she realizes, I actually can't carry on. I can't do this. So she pushes herself to, the physical boundaries, and she pushes her health to such an extent because it's all about being present and always about being around until she has to take a major break from the game.
So post-op, she comes back to Chelsea, who are becoming the dominant force in English women's football, but they still haven't managed to dislodge Barcelona at the top of the European game.
But the one sphere in which Chelsea just can't pip the best is in the Champions League. And this is a realm where Chelsea, who are still a relatively newly established club, are going against the titans of women's football. In summary, that's Barcelona, that's Lyon, that's Werder Bremen and Bayern Munich. So these are teams who've been around decades longer than Chelsea, have created structures for the women's game, and means that they are just above the rest. Chelsea get trounced in 2021 in the Champions League final by Barcelona. But she talks about the European level of the game where she really is tested, right? That's where she's up against other professionals who are operating on her level. And that's when she also realizes that everything that she's achieved with Chelsea in the Super League in England is brilliant, but perhaps she can only really take all of her plaudits if she manages to win the elusive Champions League.
So as we record this, early 2024, she has what may be her last crack at winning that elusive Champions League, because she has had the call. She has been tapped up by what has historically been the biggest team in women's soccer, the US women's national team, to come back across the Atlantic to the US, her promised land, to take over what has, for most of the last 30 years, been the biggest job in women's soccer.
Yep, and the dominant team in women's soccer. The reason that Emma Hayes is a football coach is because how much Americans love women's football and that World Cup in 1999.
Which is really right near the start of their period of dominance.
Exactly, but now they're at a very low ebb.
Yeah, they were terrible at the Women's World Cup.
They
I was
sucked
really
at the
surprised,
Women's World Cup, right?
Yeah.
And we've also moved to an era where women's football is becoming a global sport. And that means, so Spain, current World Cup champions, England gave them a pretty good run for their money. This is a game that's becoming far less US-centric, which is another story that Emma Hayes has been part of.
The rise of Europe in women's football, because Europe dominates men's football except for Leo Messi. And in women's football, we're seeing power move across the Atlantic towards Europe. But now she has to restore the balance. Her job is to restore the US to the summit of women's football. Do you think she's going to be a good coach for the US team?
I think she's a brilliant coach, so the coaching part is not in doubt, but I think that she is entering a different world. She's going from the hustle and bustle of domestic football to international football, where you only get to see your players for a few weeks every other month, where you don't train with them every single day, and you're not the person that's standing over them, watching what they're eating, their training schedules, and being, their mental health support and all the other things. And the thing about Hayes at Chelsea is that Chelsea is her dominion. She has built that club from scratch. She is the face of the Chelsea women's football team. Everything, every major decision, every minor decision went through her. So this is going to be a huge departure from the last 10 years of her life.
She's at Chelsea, what I would call a total manager, like Alex Ferguson was at Manchester United or Wenger at Arsenal, where you really control everything at a club, and that has almost disappeared from the game, but she is one of the last people in that role.
Yeah. And she's also entering into a highly professionalized environment. Her story of English football is bringing an amateur game into a professional setting. She's entering a very sophisticated existing structure, which is the US women's national team. It also means that for the first time ever in history, she's also going to be paid on a level with the US.
How much do we know?
We think it's in the region of about $300,000 to $400,000, which from what I could see is already like 2 or 3xing anything that any female manager has ever earned ever before. But it shows the degree to which the Americans are serious about this game. She's going to be getting the same salary as
in the US men's team. So legacy, can we even talk about legacy for somebody who is at the peak of her career and about to take on the biggest job that she has had?
I think we can, because she's closing a chapter on, I think, her domestic coaching career. So there are obviously going to be questions about England later. She speaks fluent Spanish. I wouldn't rule her out eventually going to manage Spain, the current world champion. So I think her career is now taking a different kind of trajectory where she's going to be in the international coaching realm. So I think it's worth us taking a moment to pause and understanding how Emma Hayes, the footprint that she's going to leave on the
What is her
domestic game.
legacy for English or European women's football?
So you've got this theory about this parallel with Southgate, which I'm interested to hear.
Yeah, so Gareth Southgate, as England men's manager, has introduced a kind of empathy that didn't previously feature much in men's football. So Southgate's idea is he wants his players to be happy, to blossom, to be full humans, to bring their whole lives to the changing room with all the issues that they may have, and he wants to listen to them and understand them and hear them. And he also thinks, well, if they're happy, if they want to be playing in this team, they'll probably play better. So he treats, very unusually in men's football, his players as human beings first. Emma Hayes seems to be an extreme version of Southgateism.
Yeah. Or they're a continuation of one or the other. I imagine they probably know each other and get on quite well. You know, in terms of legacy, the reason that I'm so drawn to a figure like Hayes is because I am around football all the time, as you are. And at some point you become inoculated to the way football people speak about football, the cliches, the vernaculars, the weird mannerisms. And she just breaks all of that because she's candid in the extreme.
She's totally herself.
She's vulnerable. She's also obsessive, and she commands loyalty to players because she gives so much of herself. I think Southgate, to some degree, I would say, I find still a little bit aloof. I haven't really heard him on a par being as vulnerable as someone like Hayes. And even now, you've just given me that, expression of what you think Southgateism is. I didn't really know that, and it's quite difficult. I feel like he's quite an impenetrable figure, and that's something that Hayes isn't.
I don't think he feels that his job is to be vulnerable. I think he feels his job is to be listening and empathetic. And she feels that, but then she also feels that she needs to bring her whole life to her job and to criticize herself in public and be vulnerable in public.
And one of the things that I also appreciate about her is that because she's an outsider in this game, she's pretty scathing about what she thinks are all of the institutional failures of football. So I mentioned that, she thinks about leadership a lot, but she's compared being a football coach to other white-collar professions. She's talked about the fact that surgeons or barristers have...
Barristers, which Americans, I think, would call trial lawyers.
And she laments the fact that there's nothing in football that provides a real philosophical underpinning for coaches in the way that other professions have. So the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, the fact that barristers have to take the bar, which is this incredibly, taxing exam they all have to go through to make sure that they're qualified to do this. She says there's nothing equivalent in football. She's got her coaching badges, but she says it was really easy getting your coaching badges because all you learn at your coaching badging sessions is how this team played in a certain era. It's all about application. There's nothing about the philosophy, and that's what she wants to develop. She thinks it's her job to develop football coaching as a branch of philosophy, psychology, ethics, just as it is, and it's not just merely sport for her. And that's something that you just don't really hear in the men's game from people who are as prominent as her in the positions that she's in.
Yeah, she said something like, how do I behave or what do I say to provoke the kind of reaction I want from a player? That's what she wants to learn. That's what she wants coaches to learn. And there is no kind of established way of teaching that, of teaching a coach how to be a human being.
And for all the strides that Hayes has made in developing training techniques around the menstrual cycle, this is still not mainstream around English football clubs or even in the international game. The fact that she is such a pioneering figure in the WSL probably hides the fact that there are only 4 of the 12 managers in the WSL are women. And she also talks about the fact that the glass ceiling still exists for a lot of her colleagues who are on the lower rungs of becoming female coaches. And maybe just like to round this bit off, one of the things I'm always struck by is how much she wants to be an example and how she wants to lift other women up. And she tells this story about Hope Powell. And Hope Powell is this totemic figure for female coaches in English football. She was a very successful English football manager. She's the first female English football manager that I've ever heard of. But Hayes describes that when she was coming up in the game, she looked up to Powell, right? She was the only real figure in her profession doing the kind of things she wants to do. But she describes her as quite an aloof figure, someone that she didn't think that she could just sort of knock on her door and get advice from, that Powell existed in this completely other space and sphere. And she doesn't want to do that. Hayes wants to be very present, and she's got friends all around, female coaching jobs, and she wants to bring them up with her and energize an entire generation of female players and female coaches. Simon, you've covered the men's game predominantly. My feeling is that someone like Emma Hayes, maybe with her strong Cockney accent and where she's from and the way she carries herself, means that she doesn't really get her dues as someone who thinks about football in a sophisticated or particularly elevated way, in the way that if she was a man, I think she'd get far more flowers.
And maybe there's a discrimination against English managers in that sense, because there haven't really been successful English male managers. And so having any kind of English accent would seem to
disqualify you from being a serious person.
Being a serious person in football, it's like trying to be a baseball manager if you have a French accent. Yeah. So there's that. But I mean, obviously, there's a complete lack of interest in most of the media, and I'll include myself, my own career, until very recently in the figures of women's football. I'm astonished at how little known Emma Hayes is, how if you read up on her, there's actually very, very little to read. So little has been written about her. It's astonishing how you can be this pioneering figure in women's football and yet almost unknown to the football-loving public. That will change if she wins World Cups and Olympics with the US women's team.
And turns around this team.
She now has this amazing opportunity to win Olympic gold with the historic giants of women's football in her first few weeks in the job.
So that brings me back to the question we started with. Do you think she would want to go into men's football?
It's an interesting question, and she hates this question. So she says that every time I'm in the media or I'm doing something mainstream, the first question is, are you going to be the first woman to break in? And she describes the fact that she's got loads of offers, that she's had a lot of offers.
Really?
Yeah.
Not as head coach, presumably.
As head coach
really?
Of non-Premier League sides. So the one that she's spoken about most recently was in 2022, when she gets what she describes as a pretty enticing offer to be the manager at a Championship side, so the second division of English football.
Well, this is very revolutionary because there has hardly ever been a woman at the top of an English professional men's club. Forest Green Rangers, I think, playing in the lowest tier of English professional men's football, appointed a woman manager, Hannah Dingley, in summer 2023, and this was sort of front page news for a while, but she was actually only in charge as a caretaker for 2 weeks, and I think she coached the pre-season game and that was it. In English football, women managers have not been given a chance as head coach, even at small clubs. So if Emma Hayes even became a Championship manager in men's football, that would be a transformational moment.
It would be incredible, because you don't even see assistant coaches or, youth team coaches. So the whole infrastructure to bring women into the men's game from the lower level doesn't exist. So she would be parachuted in probably from the top, from the women's game. She says in 2022, this is when Chelsea are going through a very turbulent period. The club is up for sale. The owner has been put under sanctions. She doesn't want to take the job because she thinks it's a very disruptive time for the club. And she says no. I think there might be something deeper in that. I think she has unfinished business in the women's game. And given how much she is an advocate for making the women's game a serious, professional, sophisticated, elite level sport, I think that despite all the offers she's getting, and I really do think that she does get a lot, because I think she would bring a lot to a club, probably just in terms of, partly cynically, the media attention that they would get for having someone like her around. I think she's going to stick it out in the women's game. And she's described that she wants to be the person that opens doors for others to trailblaze the way that she has, rather than herself breaking through the doors. So I think that she's going to stick around in the women's game and become very successful, winning World Cups, whether with the US or other national teams.
I mean, if I was chairman of a men's club, I would totally look to hiring a woman as manager, as head coach, because you can get the best woman manager in the world. You can pay her a salary if you're, say, bottom Premier League or Championship team, that would be higher than any salary in women's football. You can get the best women's coach. Whereas what a lot of English men's teams are doing is they're getting the 40th best men's coach. Well, they're trying for the 40th best men's coach, a guy who's failed at most of his jobs, who's not considered particularly impressive, because this idea is it has to be a man. It probably has to be a white man, because in football management, we still have structural discrimination against black managers and against female managers. If I were running a club, I'd say, well, look, white managers, that's an overfished pool. Sure, if I can get Pep Guardiola to coach my team, that would be great, but he's at City, he's not coming to my team. So I'm going to get the best woman manager in the world or the best black manager in the world, because those people are available if you're, say, a middling club in the Championship. So I think it's part of the stupidity of men's football that they completely overlook the idea of hiring a brilliant woman manager.
And one of the things that I appreciate about Hayes is when she's asked about diversity, she doesn't bring as much attention to the gender issue, and she really brings a lot of attention to the race diversity issue and the fact that she's noticed how, as a woman in women's sport, she probably has it easier than a black man or a person of colour in the men's game. Absolutely.
I mean, I'm actually thinking of, in France, there was for a while a woman coach of a second division team, Clermont, Corinne Diacre, who's also been French women's team manager. And when Clermont hired her, it was big story, woman is going to coach a men's team, how's that going to work? And she did really well. And after a few months, people just got bored with it and forgot about it.
The novelty.
Yeah. And she was just a manager.
We're not quite there in England. So final question, the one that we usually wrap up with. Would you want to spend an evening or have dinner with Emma Hayes?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I'm always up for meeting people in football once, not to be kind of seduced into writing public relations copy for them, but to meet and understand. And she sounds like a extremely thoughtful person. I would love to spend an evening, yeah. And you, of course, you would give anything. You would give your right arm to spend an evening with her.
Amen. Emma, if you're listening, hit me up.
Yeah. Maureen's contact details are available, yeah.
Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms. Next week's episode is on Thomas Tuchel, a wellness fanatic, brilliant manager, and a man who manages to self-immolate at every club he's successful at. Be sure to check it out. This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
and Simon Cooper.
And this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.